Look at the sign, honey. This is a private establishment. Get out before I have you dragged out. Belinda G. Smith's voice cut through the ambient jazz at Petterson's Reserve, the crown jewel of Boston's hospitality scene, where politicians closed deals over $300 whiskey and celebrities escaped paparazzi in velvet booths. The man in the tattered olive jacket didn't fit the leather-bound menu, the imported marble, or the $80,000 chandelier casting amber light across his weathered face. He looked like he'd crawled out of a dumpster, not through brass doors that required a coded entry. Belinda, the head waitress who'd cultivated her position through 5 years of perfectly remembering senators' drink orders, saw him as a threat to her carefully constructed world. Every homeless man she turned away was proof of her power, her judgment, her right to decide who belonged among the elite. Marcus Chen, a junior bartender polishing glassware behind the counter, watched the confrontation unfold. He'd seen Belinda's cruelty before, the dismissive glances, the territorial sneers, but something about this man's calm silence unnerved him. The way he sat, shoulders squared despite the insults, like someone who'd been underestimated before and knew exactly how the story ended. The man reached into his coat pocket. What he pulled out and what he said next drained every drop of color from Belinda's face, leaving her mouth open in a silent scream of realization. And what neither of them knew was that this moment had been building for 3 months, since the first complaint disappeared from the suggestion box, since the first undesirable guest was quietly escorted out, since Petterson's Reserve stopped being his father's dream and became someone else's kingdom.
Donald M. Petterson sat in his penthouse office 12 blocks away, the city lights of Boston reflecting off floor-to-ceiling windows. It was 10:30 p.m. on a Thursday, long past the hour when reasonable executives went home to their families. But Donald hadn't been reasonable since the funeral, since he'd inherited an empire he'd been too grief-stricken to properly manage. Tonight, a manila envelope had arrived via private courier. No return address, no note, just the word "watch" written in red ink across the seal. Inside, 3 items that made his blood run cold. The first was a printed transcript of security footage timestamps. November 4th, 9:47 p.m. Elderly woman refused service, coat deemed inappropriate. November 11th, 8:15 p.m. Veteran in uniform redirected to sister location. None exists nearby. November 18th, 6:32 p.m. Solo diner, black male, told reservations full while empty tables visible in frame. The second was a photograph, grainy, taken from someone's phone, showing Belinda Smith and 2 other staff members laughing, holding up a handwritten sign, "Dress code. If you have to ask, you can't afford it." The third item made his hands shake. A financial audit, amateur but thorough, showing a 34% decline in diverse clientele over 6 months, cross-referenced with a 28% increase in VIP membership fees, a program Donald had never approved. Someone had been building a wall around his father's legacy, brick by discriminatory brick. Donald opened his employee database and searched for complaints. The system showed 0 flags for his flagship location. 0. He switched to the hidden admin panel, the one his father had installed as a sanity check against corporate corruption, and ran the same search. 47 deleted complaints, 47 voices erased. He pulled up Belinda Smith's personnel file, 5 years of perfect reviews, 3 Employee of the Quarter awards, a glowing recommendation from the regional manager calling her the face of Petterson excellence. Then he noticed the pattern in her shift logs. Every Friday and Saturday, peak nights, she worked the front entrance, alone, with full discretion over seating assignments. Donald's father had built Petterson's Reserve on a simple philosophy. Every person who walks through that door is someone's son, someone's mother, someone's hero. Treat them accordingly. When had that become every person we allow through that door? His assistant had left a note on his desk. "Your 11 p.m. is here." Donald glanced at the appointment calendar. He'd blocked the time himself 3 hours ago, after reading the envelope twice and making a decision that would either save his company or destroy it. He stood, walked to his private closet, and pulled out the costume he'd assembled from a Goodwill in Dorchester. frayed olive jacket, scuffed boots, a theatrical makeup kit for adding grime and age. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "She's working tonight, front section. You have one shot to see what you've built, or what you've let rot." Donald stared at his reflection in the darkened window, the billionaire in the $4,000 suit, about to become invisible. What he didn't know was that Belinda Smith had been waiting for this moment too, and she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. If you're already hooked by Donald's undercover mission and want to see how this confrontation explodes, do me a huge favor, smash that like button, drop a comment telling me what you think Belinda will do when she discovers the truth, and subscribe to Midnight Plot Stories so you never miss these jaw-dropping tales of justice and redemption. Your support keeps these stories coming, and trust me, what happens next will leave you speechless. Now let's continue.
The brass nameplate gleamed under the street lamp. Petterson's Reserve, established 1995. Donald's father had polished that plate every morning for 15 years, claiming it brought good luck. Now it was someone else's job, someone who probably didn't know the story behind the tarnished P where Donald had scratched it with his tricycle at age 6. Donald pulled the olive jacket tighter against the November wind, feeling the fabric scratch against his collar. The makeup artist had done excellent work. 3 weeks of prosthetic stubble, darkened hollows under his eyes, dirt ground into his fingernails. He looked like a man who'd lost everything. The irony wasn't lost on him. He reached for the polished brass handle, but it didn't budge. His hand hovered over the call button, the entry system he'd personally approved after the insurance company insisted on security upgrades. When had security become exclusion? A young couple emerged, designer shopping bags in hand, and the door swung open with a whisper of expensive hinges. Donald moved to catch it, but the woman's eyes flicked over his appearance with practiced distaste. She let it close in his face. He pressed the buzzer. Through the frosted glass, he could see movement, shadows of people who worked for him, who cashed checks with his signature, who had no idea their employer was standing outside like a beggar. The irony was suffocating. The intercom crackled. "Petterson's Reserve, may I help you?" Female voice, young, unfamiliar. "I'd like to come in for a drink," Donald said, roughening his voice to match his appearance. A pause, long enough to be insulting. "Sir, we're a membership establishment. Do you have a reservation?" "No, but—" "Then I'm afraid we can't accommodate walk-ins tonight. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at O'Malley's, 3 blocks down." O'Malley's, a dive bar his father used to love before the neighborhood improved and pushed it out. Donald had signed the development permits himself. "I have money," he said, hating the pleading edge that crept into his voice. This was his bar, his empire, and he was begging for entry. "Sir, it's not about money. It's about maintaining a certain atmosphere for our members. I'm sure you understand." Through the glass, he could see her now, blonde, mid-20s, arms crossed. She wasn't even looking at the door anymore. She'd already forgotten him. Donald pulled a $20 bill from his pocket, pressed it against the glass. "Please, I've had a long day. Just one drink." The woman finally turned, her eyes landing on the crumpled bill, then on his face. Her expression shifted from annoyance to something darker, contempt mixed with satisfaction. "Security," she called over her shoulder, voice loud enough for him to hear through the glass. "We have a situation at the front door." Donald stood frozen, his own money pressed against his own door, while 2 men in black suits materialized from inside his father's dream. They were already reaching for the handle, their faces set in professional menace. He'd designed this system to protect his guests. He never imagined he'd be on the wrong side of it. The security guards had let him in, barely, after Donald mentioned he'd spoken to Mr. Petterson personally about visiting. Technically true, they had exchanged glances and stepped aside with visible reluctance. One of them muttered something about checking with management as Donald moved past them into the warmth. The interior hit him like a memory he'd tried to forget. His father's original exposed brick, now hidden behind imported Italian panels. The communal tables where strangers became friends, replaced by private booths with velvet ropes. Even the smell had changed. Less beer and laughter, more leather and expensive cologne. This wasn't renovation, it was erasure. Donald chose a seat at the bar, the least exclusive spot in the room. The marble felt cold under his forearms, and he could feel eyes on him from every direction. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted, voices lowered, glances sharpened. He was the wrong note in their carefully composed symphony. 20 minutes passed. Donald watched the bartender, Marcus according to his name tag, serve 7 customers. All of them had arrived after Donald. Marcus's eyes kept sliding toward him, then away, like he wanted to acknowledge Donald's existence but couldn't quite find the courage. Then she arrived. Belinda G. Smith moved through the bar like a queen inspecting her domain, black heels clicking against marble, her smile reserved for those who deserved it. She swept past Donald without a flicker of recognition, her perfume trailing behind her like a declaration of superiority. "Mr. Hammond," her voice transformed into honey and warmth as she reached the booth 3 seats down from Donald. "We weren't expecting you tonight. Your usual table?" Donald recognized the man, James Hammond, tech CEO, recently featured in Forbes. He'd met him twice at charity functions, had even donated to his literacy foundation. Hammond wouldn't recognize him now. No one would. "Belinda, you're a savior," Hammond said, his voice carrying across the bar. "Flew in from San Francisco an hour ago, absolutely exhausted. Let me get you the 25-year Macallan, on the house, of course, and I'll have chef prepare your steak Pittsburgh style, just how you like it." Belinda touched his shoulder with practiced familiarity. "And I'll have chef prepare your steak Pittsburgh style, just how you like it." Donald raised his hand slightly, trying to catch her attention. She turned, her eyes passing over him like he was furniture, and walked toward the kitchen. He waited, watched her return with Hammond's scotch and crystal that cost more than most people's monthly rent, watched her laugh at his jokes, refill his water before he asked, bring him warm bread with herb butter that wasn't on the menu. Donald's throat was dry, his patience was wearing thin, but more than that, his heart was breaking. This woman who represented his company, who wore a pin with his family's crest, had mastered the art of selective humanity. She could conjure warmth for wealth and ice for everyone else. When she finally glanced his direction after 23 minutes, Donald had counted, her expression didn't shift from the pleasant mask she'd worn for Hammond. It simply went blank. Not hostile yet, just empty, like he wasn't worth the energy of emotion. "Can I help you?" 3 words delivered with the enthusiasm of someone asked to take out trash. Donald met her eyes and saw his company's future staring back at him. "Yes," he said quietly, "I'd like to order." Donald reached for the menu, but Belinda's hand was faster. She slid it away from him with 2 fingers like it might contaminate her manicure. "Our menu is prefixed this evening," she said, her voice professionally neutral in a way that was somehow more insulting than outright hostility. $65 per person, minimum, plus gratuity. Donald had eliminated the prefix menu 3 years ago after customer complaints. Someone had brought it back without his authorization. He filed that information away for later and forced his voice to remain steady. "That's fine. I'll take the burger." He'd seen it listed on the bar menu behind Marcus, $18, the cheapest entree in the establishment. His father's recipe, the one item Donald had insisted they never remove, and a glass of water. Belinda's laugh was soft, almost musical. It would have sounded pleasant if not for the cruelty underneath. "The burger is from members only. It's quite popular, actually. We can't waste it on—" She gestured vaguely at his appearance, not bothering to finish the sentence. "Then just the water," Donald said. "Please." "Water is complimentary for paying customers." She crossed her arms, her posture shifting into something more aggressive. Behind her, Hammond was absorbed in his phone, oblivious. Marcus had stopped polishing glasses and was watching with barely concealed discomfort. "Are you planning to order something, or are you just here to waste my time?"
Donald pulled a 20 from his pocket, the same crumpled bill he'd pressed against the door. He smoothed it on the bar. Fries, then. Just fries. Belinda stared at the money like he'd placed a dead rat in front of her. Her lip curled, and when she looked back at his face, something had shifted. The professional mask was cracking, revealing the contempt she'd been holding back. "Sir, I'm going to be very clear with you." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt louder than shouting. "This is Petterson's Reserve. Do you know what that means? It means exclusivity. It means standards. It means we don't serve people who look like they crawled out of a heating vent." The bar had gone silent. Donald could feel dozens of eyes on them, some uncomfortable, some curious, some nodding in agreement. His own customers, approving of his humiliation. "This establishment has a reputation to maintain, and that reputation does not include serving charity cases who wander in off the street looking for handouts." Donald sat motionless, his $20 bill still on the counter between them. In the window's reflection, he could see his father's ghost, watching, disappointed, heartbroken. "So here's what's going to happen," Petterson said, her voice sharp as breaking glass. "You're going to take your money, walk out that door, and thank me for not having security throw you out on your ass."
Donald reached into his inner jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a $100 bill. Crisp, uncirculated, fresh from the bank that morning, back when he'd been a billionaire in a tailored suit planning an experiment in humility. He placed it on the marble bar next to the crumpled 20, the contrast between the two bills almost symbolic. "Will this cover fries and water?" he asked, his voice still quiet, still polite, though every word cost him more than the currency on the counter. Belinda stared at the bill. Her eyes narrowed, and Donald watched the calculations happen behind them, not about whether to serve him, but about how to explain away evidence that contradicted her narrative. She snatched the 100 off the bar, held it up to the light, examined it like a detective studying evidence at a crime scene. The bar remained silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. Even Hammond had looked up from his phone, sensing drama more compelling than his emails. "Where did you get this?" Belinda's voice had changed. The condescension was gone, replaced by something sharper, accusatory. She was building a new story, one that would justify her cruelty. "I earned it," Donald said simply. "You earned it," she repeated his words with theatrical disbelief, holding the bill higher so nearby customers could see. "You, in your filthy jacket that smells like a dumpster, with dirt under your fingernails and God knows what in your hair, just happen to have a crisp $100 bill. Yes, you're a liar." She said it loudly, definitively, like a judge delivering a verdict. "Marcus, call security, now." Marcus hadn't moved, his hand frozen on a glass. "Belinda, maybe we should just—" "I said call security." Her voice cracked across the room like a whip. "This man is a thief. Look at this bill. It's perfect, unmarked, the kind you get from an ATM, not from honest work done by someone who looks like they sleep in a cardboard box." Donald felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't just classism anymore. This was something darker, the willingness to destroy someone completely rather than admit being wrong. "I didn't steal anything," he said, but his voice was drowned out by Belinda's. "You picked someone's pocket or grabbed it off a table when someone wasn't looking." She spun toward the other customers, transforming into a performer, a protector. "Has anyone here lost a $100 bill? Anyone noticed this man near their belongings?" Heads shook, but no one spoke up for him either. They just watched, comfortable in their booths, entertained by someone else's destruction. "I've worked in high-end establishments for 5 years, Belinda continued, directing her monologue to the room. "I know the difference between earned money and stolen money. This," she waved the bill like evidence, "is stolen, and I will not let Petterson's Reserve become a haven for criminals." She threw the 100 back at Donald. It fluttered to the bar, landing in a small puddle of condensation. "Security is on their way," she said, triumph bleeding into her voice. "And when they get here, we're going to have a very interesting conversation about where you really got that money. Maybe the police will want to hear it too."
Donald looked at his own money, soaking on his own bar, while a woman wearing his family's crest threatened him with arrest. The irony had stopped being funny somewhere around the second chapter of this nightmare. He should reveal himself, end this, but something kept him frozen, the need to see how far his empire had fallen. Marcus was holding a phone, but he hadn't dialed yet. His eyes met Donald's, and there was a question there, a hesitation. Then the heavy footsteps of security echoed across the marble floor, and the question became irrelevant.
"Is there a problem here?" The voice came from booth 7, a woman in her 50s, dripping in diamonds that caught the chandelier light like tiny spotlights. Victoria Ashworth. Donald recognized her immediately. She'd attended his father's funeral, had given a speech about legacy and community values. Her family had donated $50,000 to the Petterson Foundation last year. Belinda turned toward her like a flower finding sunlight. "Nothing we can't handle, Mrs. Ashworth, just removing an unwanted element." Victoria stood, her champagne flute still in hand, and moved closer. Her heels clicked with the same authority as Belinda's, and Donald realized with sickening clarity that they were cut from the same cloth. Money recognized money, class protected class. "I saw the whole thing," Victoria said, her voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "He tried to use a $100 bill, obviously stolen." She looked at Donald the way someone might examine a bug. "You know, this is exactly what's wrong with this city. These people think they can just walk into our spaces, take advantage of our hospitality." "Our spaces?" Donald repeated quietly, tasting the words. "Excuse me." Victoria's eyebrows arched with practiced indignation. "You said our spaces? This is a public establishment. Anyone can—" "Public!" Victoria laughed, and several other patrons joined in. "Sweetheart, the door code alone keeps it from being public. This is a place for people who contribute to society, people who matter." She gestured at his jacket with her champagne flute, "not people who smell of failure." A man in a navy suit 2 tables over chimed in. "Shoulda stayed at the shelter, buddy. This is embarrassing for everyone." "For him, you mean," another voice added. Female, young, probably on her 3rd cocktail, judging by the slight slur. "I'm trying to enjoy my anniversary dinner, not watch poverty tourism." Donald felt something crack inside his chest. These weren't just random customers. These were people he'd personally courted, whose patronage he'd celebrated in quarterly reports. The Ashworths, the Hendersons, the Kims, families he'd sent Christmas cards to, whose children he'd given internships to. They were the foundation of his success, and they were cruel. This is why we have standards. This is why we screen our clientele, because if we let just anyone through those doors, we become just another dive bar. "Hear, hear," someone called out. Actual applause followed. Donald looked at Marcus, the only person not participating in his destruction. The bartender's knuckles were white around the phone, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful, but he said nothing, did nothing. Fear was a powerful anesthetic to empathy. "The worst part," Victoria continued, warming to her role as moral authority, "is the entitlement. He actually thought he belonged here, with us." She shook her head sadly, as if disappointed by a child. "Someone should tell him, you can't buy class, even with stolen money." The laughter that followed was the sound of Donald's empire revealing its true face. His father had built a home. Donald had inherited it, and somehow, through neglect or ignorance or the simple passage of time, allowed it to become a cathedral of contempt. Security had arrived. 2 men Donald had hired 3 months after, reading their impressive resumes. They stood behind him now, hands hovering near his shoulders, waiting for permission to make him disappear. "Get him out," Belinda said, her voice flat with finality, "before he ruins everyone's evening more than he already has." Donald stood slowly, not because he was ready to leave, but because something inside him had finally, irrevocably broken. He looked at the faces around him, people he'd enriched, employed, served, and saw nothing he recognized as human. "No," he said quietly. The single word hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Donald remained standing, his hands at his sides, his back straight despite the days of carefully cultivated slouch. Something in his posture had shifted, and Belinda noticed. Her eyes narrowed with a new kind of anger, the rage of someone who'd expected submission and received defiance instead. "What did you say?" Her voice was low, dangerous. "I said no." Donald spoke louder this time, clear enough for every corner of the bar to hear. "I'm not leaving. I came here for a meal, I have money to pay for it, and I'm staying." Belinda's face flushed scarlet. "You don't get to decide that. This is private property, and you're trespassing. I walked through an unlocked door. I asked politely to order food. That's not trespassing. That's patronage." "Patronage?" The word exploded from her mouth like a curse. "You think you're a patron? Look at yourself. You're a stain on the furniture. You're a joke. You're a paying customer," Donald interrupted, and something about the calm in his voice made her angrier. "You're nothing," Belinda shrieked, all pretense of professionalism evaporating like steam. "You're a parasite who wandered in from whatever gutter you crawled out of, thinking you could sit with your betters and nobody would notice." The security guards shifted uncomfortably. One of them, the younger one with the scar above his eyebrow, touched Belinda's elbow. "Ma'am, maybe we should—" She jerked away from him. "Don't touch me. Do your job and remove this trash." "I'm not trash," Donald said quietly. "Yes, you are." The words tore from her throat, raw and primal. Years of something ugly poured out in that scream. Frustration, insecurity, the desperate need to prove herself better than someone, anyone. "You're trash, and you belong in the gutter where trash lives. That's where people like you belong. In the dirt, in the dark, where decent people don't have to look at you." Victoria Ashworth had retreated to her booth, suddenly uncomfortable with the monster she'd helped create. Other patrons looked away, studied their drinks, their phones, anything to avoid witnessing what they'd encouraged. "You think I don't see through you?" Belinda was pacing now, her voice climbing toward hysteria. "You probably planned this, probably wanted attention, wanted charity, wanted to make us feel guilty for having standards. Well, it won't work. I will not let you ruin this establishment's reputation with your poverty and your stolen money and your pathetic little performance." "Belinda," Marcus's voice cut through her tirade. "Stop." She whirled on him. "Shut up, Marcus. This doesn't concern you." "This concerns all of us." Marcus set down his towel, his hands trembling slightly. "This isn't right. What's not right is him." Belinda pointed at Donald like he was identifying a criminal in a lineup. "What's not right is us having to explain to our real customers why we're letting homeless people sit at our bar. What's not right is—" "That's enough." Donald's voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made her pause. "You've made your point. You think I'm beneath you. You think I don't belong. You've made that abundantly clear to everyone in this room." "Then leave!" Belinda's voice cracked, spittle flying from her lips. "Get back to the gutter. Get back to whatever hole you climbed out of. Get out of our bar, out of our sight, out of our world, because you are not welcome here. You will never be welcome here." Donald reached into his jacket pocket one more time. His fingers found the small leather wallet he'd been carrying since this experiment began, the one item he'd hoped he wouldn't need to use. "Our bar?" he said softly, pulling out a black card embossed with gold lettering. Interesting choice of words. Belinda was still screaming, too lost in her rage to notice what he was holding. "I said get out! Security, I want him arrested for trespassing. I want him charged. I want—" "Belinda," the new voice came from the entrance. Everyone turned. Thomas Whitmore stood in the doorway, the general manager of Petterson's Reserve, his face drained of all color. He was staring at Donald's hand, at the card catching the light, at the owner's card that only one person in the world possessed.
Thomas Whitmore's appearance didn't stop what was already in motion. The two security guards had their orders, and Belinda's screaming had reached a pitch that demanded resolution. The older guard, built like a linebacker with graying temples, moved behind Donald while his partner circled to the front. "Sir, you need to come with us." The older guard's voice was professional, almost apologetic. His hand hovered near Donald's shoulder, but hadn't made contact yet. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Donald didn't move. He held the black card in his palm, but kept it low, out of Belinda's line of sight. Thomas was moving through the crowd now, his face a mask of barely controlled panic, but he was too far away, blocked by tables and patrons who'd risen from their seats to watch the finale of their evening's entertainment. "I have a question," Donald said, his voice cutting through the chaos with unnerving calm. "You can ask it outside," the younger guard said, reaching for Donald's arm. Donald pulled back, not aggressively, but firmly. "I'd like to ask it here, in front of witnesses." "You don't get to make demands," Belinda spat, though some of the fury had drained from her voice. Thomas's presence had unsettled her, even if she didn't understand why yet. "You've already disrupted enough." "What is the official policy?" Donald interrupted, his eyes moving from Belinda to the guards to the crowd of watching faces of Petterson's reserve regarding customer service. The question hung in the air like a courtroom challenge. Marcus, still behind the bar, went very still. "What?" Belinda's laugh was shrill, confused. "The policy. It used to be written on a plaque behind the bar. My father had it commissioned when he opened this place 30 years ago. Donald's voice remained steady, almost conversational, despite the hands now gripping both his arms. "I'm curious if it's still there, or if someone removed it." Thomas had stopped moving. He stood 10 feet away, one hand raised as if trying to signal something but unable to speak. "Sir, we need to go, now." The older guard's grip tightened, starting to lift Donald from his seat. "Marcus," Donald called out, ignoring the pressure on his arms, "is the plaque still there?" Marcus's eyes darted to Thomas, then to Belinda, then to the wall behind the bar. Slowly he turned and moved to the far end of the counter. There, partially hidden behind stacked wine bottles and deliberately obscured, was a brass plaque, tarnished from neglect. "Read it, please." "Marcus, don't you dare," Belinda started. "Read it," Thomas echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus cleared his throat. His hands were shaking as he moved the wine bottles aside. "Every guest who enters these doors carries a story we have not yet heard. Treat each person as you would hope to be treated in your hour of need. For we are not merely in the business of serving food and drink, we are in the business of preserving human dignity." Signed, Michael J. Petterson, founder. The silence that followed was absolute. Donald looked at Belinda, whose face had gone from red to chalk white. "So, I'll ask you directly, Miss Smith, based on that policy, the founding principle of this establishment, did you preserve my dignity tonight? Or did you decide I wasn't human enough to deserve it?" The guard's hands had loosened on his arms. They were looking at Thomas now, waiting for guidance that wasn't coming. "Who are you?" Belinda's voice had lost all its venom, replaced by something worse, fear, the slow creeping realization that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. Donald held up the black card, letting it catch the light. Gold lettering reflected across the polished marble. Donald M. Petterson, owner. "I'm the man," he said quietly, "who just watched his father's dream become a nightmare." The black card seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Donald held it between two fingers, letting it rotate slowly so everyone in the bar could see the embossed gold lettering. The card that couldn't be faked, the card that only existed in singular form, the card that granted absolute authority over every Petterson property in the country. Belinda's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. No sound came out. "Thomas," Donald said, his voice conversational as if they were discussing quarterly reports over coffee. "How long have you worked for me?" Thomas Whitmore looked like he might vomit. 7 years, Mr. Petterson." The name detonated across the bar like an explosion. Gasps, sharp intakes of breath, the scrape of chairs as people stood or sat or simply froze in various states of shock. Victoria Ashworth's champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor. No one moved to clean it. 7 years, Donald repeated, and in those 7 years did I ever authorize a prefix menu? No, sir. Did I ever approve a door code? No, sir. Did I ever at any point suggest that we screen customers based on their appearance? Thomas's silence was answer enough.
Donald stood slowly, and the security guards stepped back like they'd been shocked. He brushed off his tattered jacket, a gesture that was somehow more dignified than any suit he'd ever worn. Belinda G. Smith. He said her full name like a judge reading a sentence. She flinched. You've worked here for 5 years, according to your personnel file. 5 years of what you called maintaining standards. 5 years of deciding who deserves humanity and who doesn't. Mr. Petterson, I didn't... Her voice cracked. Tears were streaming down her face now, black mascara cutting tracks through her foundation. If you had known it was me... Donald's voice remained quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Then you would have smiled and served me and treated me with the respect you believe I deserve as the owner. But that man over there, he pointed to an elderly gentleman in worn corduroy sitting near the window, someone Donald had noticed being ignored all night. He gets nothing? That woman who asked for a glass of water 20 minutes ago and was told the bathroom was for paying customers only? She gets nothing? They're not human enough for basic decency? Belinda was sobbing now, her carefully constructed persona shattered in as many pieces as Victoria's champagne flute. I came here tonight because I received evidence that my father's establishment had become something he would never recognize. I needed to see it for myself. I needed to know if the rumors were true. He looked at Thomas. They weren't rumors. Thomas bowed his head. Donald turned to Marcus, who stood frozen behind the bar, his eyes wide. You tried to intervene. You asked her to stop. Why? Marcus swallowed hard. Because it was wrong, sir. Because that plaque, your father's words, they meant something to me when I was hired. They're the reason I took this job. And yet you stayed silent while she screamed at me to get back to the gutter? I'm sorry. Marcus's voice was barely audible. I was afraid. Of her? Donald gestured at Belinda, who had collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Of losing my job? Of speaking up and being the next person thrown out? Marcus met Donald's eyes. I was a coward. The honesty in that admission hung in the air. Donald studied the young bartender, the shame in his posture, the regret in his eyes. This was someone who knew he'd failed a test of character. Unlike everyone else in the room, he wasn't making excuses. Thomas, Donald turned back to his general manager. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., my office. Bring complete records of every complaint filed at this location for the past 12 months. Bring staffing records, termination reports, and the unauthorized policy changes. All of them. Yes, sir. Donald's eyes swept the room one final time, landing on each face that had participated in his humiliation. As for the rest of you, my valued customers, I'll be reviewing your membership status personally. He walked towards the door, his boots heavy on the marble floor. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at the plaque Marcus had revealed, at his father's words gathering dust behind wine bottles. This bar reopens in 1 week, and when it does, everyone will be welcome.
Donald arrived at Petterson's Reserve at 6 a.m., 3 hours before the staff meeting he'd mandated, 4 hours before Thomas was scheduled to deliver his reports. He used his master key to unlock the brass doors and stepped into the silence of an empty bar that smelled of lemon polish and regret. The first thing he did was find his father's plaque. He lifted it from behind the wine bottles where it had been hidden, exiled to make room for expensive labels that impressed the wrong people. The brass was tarnished, neglected, but the words were still clear. He carried it to the main wall behind the bar, the most visible spot in the entire establishment, and hung it where everyone, staff and guests alike, would see it the moment they walked in. Then he started removing things. The velvet ropes that separated premium sections from regular seating, the printed signs advertising VIP experiences and exclusive member pricing, the leather-bound menus with their inflated costs and pretentious descriptions. By 7 a.m., he had 3 garbage bags full of the trappings of elitism. At 7:30, Marcus arrived early. He stopped in the doorway, staring at Donald in his tailored suit, the real Donald, the one who owned buildings and employed hundreds, doing the manual work of tearing down barriers. "You're early," Donald said, not looking up from the membership placard he was unscrewing from the wall. "I couldn't sleep." Marcus moved closer, hesitant. "Mr. Petterson, about last night." "You were honest with me. That matters." Donald set down his screwdriver. "You admitted your fear. Most people in that room are still making excuses." "I should have done more." "Yes, you should have." Donald didn't soften it. "But you recognized that. Belinda still thinks she was protecting the business. That's the difference between someone who can grow and someone who can't." By 8 a.m., other staff members began arriving. They entered cautiously, nervously, taking in the changes with wide eyes. The ropes gone, the plaque restored, their boss in shirt sleeves, physically dismantling the temple of contempt they'd all served. Thomas arrived at 8:45 with 3 banker's boxes of documents. His eyes were bloodshot, his suit rumpled. He'd clearly been up all night. "Conference room," Donald said simply. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Donald sat at the head of the table surrounded by his management team, Thomas, the floor supervisors, the head chef, the events coordinator. He laid out the complaints Thomas had brought, reading them aloud one by one. 15 employees had quit. 47 complaints had been deleted. A culture of discrimination had been implemented systematically, deliberately, with Thomas's passive approval. "I was supposed to trust you," Donald said, his voice level but carrying the weight of betrayal. "My father promoted you. He believed you understood what this place meant." "I failed him," Thomas said quietly, "and I failed you." "You failed everyone who walked through that door hoping for hospitality and received contempt instead." Donald slid a folder across the table. "Your resignation letter. I've already prepared it. You can sign it, or I can terminate you for cause. Either way, you're done here." Thomas signed without argument. Some failures couldn't be redeemed with apologies. The bar reopened at 5 p.m. No door code, no dress requirements, no prefix menu. Just food, drink, and a promise engraved in brass that everyone could see. Every guest carries a story we have yet to hear. Donald stood at the entrance as the first customers arrived. An elderly couple in modest clothing, uncertain, expecting rejection. A young man in a construction vest, still dusty from his shift. A woman with 2 children who kept glancing at the prices nervously. "Welcome to Petterson's Reserve," Donald said to each of them, personally. "We're honored to have you." Marcus stood behind the bar, the plaque visible over his shoulder, serving drinks with a lightness that hadn't been there before. The burden of cowardice, once acknowledged, became lighter. By 8 p.m., the bar was full, not with senators and celebrities seeking exclusivity, but with people seeking connection. Laughter replaced judgment. Conversation replaced surveillance. Donald sat at the same bar stool where he'd been humiliated 12 hours earlier. Marcus placed a burger and a glass of water in front of him without being asked, the order that had started everything. "On the house," Marcus said. "No, everyone pays. That's the point. Everyone's money is the same color. Everyone's dignity is worth protecting." He took a bite of his father's recipe, the burger that had almost been denied him, and tasted something he'd forgotten in his years of chasing expansion and profits. He tasted home.
You just witnessed Donald reclaim his father's legacy and transform hatred into hospitality. You felt the injustice, the rage, the redemption. But here's the hard truth. I poured hours into crafting this story for you, staying up late to make sure every word hit just right. And yet, 78% of you watching right now haven't subscribed. That hurts. It genuinely does. Because while you got this entire emotional journey completely free, I'm sitting here wondering if you'll even remember Midnight Plot Stories exists when the next story drops. If this story made you feel something, anger at Belinda, triumph at Donald's reveal, hope at that final burger, then prove it. Hit that subscribe button. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it tells me that these stories matter to you, that the hours I spend writing them aren't disappearing into the void. And if you really want to make a difference, share this video. Send it to someone who needs to hear a story about dignity, about standing up to cruelty, about redemption. Because right now, the algorithm is deciding whether to show my next story to thousands or to bury it forever. And that decision is based on whether you choose to share this. I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for much, just a subscribe and a share. That's it. Don't let this story end here. Don't let the next person miss out on what you just experienced. Subscribe to Midnight Plot Stories. Share this video. And I'll see you in the next story if you choose to show up.